But I'm sort of fascinated by the difference between depictions, well, not just depictions, but the reality of sort of lower class existence in Europe, which is extremely urban by all accounts. You have the public housing blocks, council estates, they call them, right? Kind of gray buildings. Being from California, I'm so much more used to seeing poverty attached to sort of single family homes, kind of low density.
Yeah.
Uh, you think of like the vast Central Valley, California. It's you have poverty, but with 2 acres or half an acre, which would be a pretty lavish amount of space if you're in Scotland or England or something.
Right. The story of the the social housing in Britain is really tied to the Second World War and the Blitz, which obviously heavily damaged many British cities, and including in that damage was to sort of slums, really, which were Victorian slums. And at the end of the Second World War, the Labour government came to power. It was a bit of a surprise defeat for Churchill, and Clement Attlee came to power as a Labour Prime Minister. And there was a sort of a decision really to take a chance really and to demolish over many years really, a sort of period of about 10 or 15 years, the remaining slums, and to move those people into new social housing. And that social housing was mostly tower blocks. Now, some of those projects were well executed, I say some, and some of them were not so well executed. They were sort of underfunded. They didn't receive enough maintenance and so on. So it was a bit of a mixed bag in terms of how those projects turned out, those social housing projects. But they did get a reputation. I think this was partly driven by, the kind of right-wing press, which was always opposed to the tower blocks on principle, really. And of course, there's a lot of snobbery involved there as well, sort of anti-working class sentiment. Talking about sink estates and crime-ridden tower blocks and etc. But there wasn't just the people there who were living in them. I think it was also local government neglect. In some cases, architectural, kind of errors. There was, but these blocks still have their defenders.
Have you guys heard about Dormzilla in UC San Diego? Have you guys heard about that?
No.
So, I think pretty comparable to what you're talking about that happened in Europe. There's a guy who donated like millions of dollars to UC San Diego on the condition that they build a dorm, because they have a very big student housing crisis down there. And on the further condition that they build the dorm based upon his design, which is interesting because I believe he's like not an architect or anything. And so this guy designed this dorm so that it's like 90% of the dorm rooms have no window. And they're just tiny rooms, no window. And I just can't imagine like what the quality of life would be living in a place like that. So it's this huge, just cement block of a building, and everyone's in there with like no windows. I mean, even like prisoners often have a small window. And I can't remember if they're actually going to build a thing or not. It's going to be interesting to see what happens with that. But I mean, if they do build that thing, they should definitely monitor the psychological well-being of those poor students.
It's like an above sea level submarine existence.
I get that mental picture. Yeah.
That's I do remember that now. I just want to say real quick, UC Santa Cruz has really nice dorms. It's like an Ewok village. It's beautiful, but
they do. I've been in a few of them. Yeah, super nice.
Yeah. These are pretty big universities in California, Julian.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So I do remember that now about Dormzilla. Was that the only critique or criticism floated on that, with the lack of windows, or was it also just how compact the dorms were?
Yeah, the major pro is that it would fix the student housing crisis, but then it's just this long list of cons. It's just like one after another, just issues that are just not ideal. I mean, dorms are always kind of terrible, even nice ones like UC Santa Cruz, but boy, like I can't imagine that sort of situation.
It kind of
Yeah.
brings to mind this topic which comes up quite a lot on Twitter, which is pod life, yeah, living in the pod and eating the bugs. This kind of vision that people have, I think, not unreasonably, that we are going to end up living in these kind of closets, yeah, in the future, eating bug protein.
No,
So
it's weird because I mean that criticism exists alongside the there's not enough housing criticism, right?
right,
Like a kind of YIMBY politics, and yet I think a big part of the solution would look something like a lot of these pods. You know, if they were to just start erecting towers willy nilly all over the place, that radically brought down the cost of living in like a New York or a San Francisco, people would like that, but I don't think they would like what it would look like, and it probably would look like Dormzilla.
There's a
There's a trick.
futurist philosopher I kind of enjoy. His name is FM 2030, and he had this vision for the future that I've never really seen anyone totally run with. But he thinks in the future that we're not going to live in one solitary dwelling place. We're going to have temporary living spaces where we just jump from one place to the next. And it's interesting to me that like no one is really talking about this, but it's kind of under the surface being created by companies like Airbnb. And there's another company where you can live in a city for like 6 months at a time, and then you go to a different city and live in an apartment. And there is a subclass of people who already are doing this where they don't necessarily have one. I work with a guy like this, just works from home, jumps from one Airbnb to the next, and that's just like his life. I think that there's going to be a growing class of people like that who just kind of like reject the idea of having one solitary living space. If that's the case, like maybe it wouldn't be horrible to, jump in and out of some of these pod like places because you're existing temporarily in a space and you're not there to like be in the dwelling. You're there to experience the city life, for example. Kind of interesting. I don't think that all societies go in that way, but I do think a certain class of people are going towards that lifestyle.
Yeah, it feels
right.
they sound a bit like digital nomads or something, kind of a digital nomad lifestyle, right?
Yeah, I guess that would be the technical term. Yeah.
It just goes to show you that, like, a healthy life is a whole ecosystem of habits, and maybe if other aspects of societies were positive, a pod life wouldn't be so great. So I mean, it wouldn't be so bad. That is. So if you are
I don't
not
know.
like
You're not going to convince
we're not
me, I'm
into
afraid.
gaming online, if you make sure to go out and to constantly be active and to want to change your
Mm.
surroundings, then going from pod to pod, where you're not spending a ton of time at home anyway, wouldn't be so bad. But people are sedentary, and they want to play video games for 5 hours a day. Combine that with living in a pod, well, then it becomes something more nefarious and detrimental.
Or if you're just on in VR all day in your pod, and so you're living in like Mark Zuckerberg's metaverse as if you were
Yeah.
other places, but really just in some sad little dark room. Hopefully, that's not the vision for humanity's
Did you ever
future. I'm
see?
sure it will be for some people.
Did you see that movie Gamer? It
No, I
was
never have.
not
Me
critically
neither.
acclaimed by any stretch. It had a who is I forgot his name. Um, I want to say Russell Crowe. He's sort of like a mirror image of Russell Crowe. Anyway, it's about a guy who's sort of like in a metaverse playing video games all the time. And at one point, we see some of the players in real life. And there's one that stands out. He's like a morbidly obese guy, like in this kind of small apartment. And you know what? I might be confusing it with that movie Surrogates with Bruce Willis, where people are like so their health has gotten so bad they end up having like these robots or cyborgs who go out and live life for them. I might be confusing the two films, but either way, they do present a kind of pod life near future dystopia pretty badly, pretty well.
I think there was a
Yeah.
Black Mirror episode about that too.
Yeah.
That rings a bell, definitely.
When is Black Mirror going to come back? Actually, they really take a lot of time between seasons.
I canceled my Netflix subscription, but the only thing that's going to make me bring it back is if Black Mirror comes back.
Yeah, that's actually British for the most part. Or it began as a British production. Now it's like a American British co.
It's that guy Charlie Brooker, I believe his name is. I've listened to some interviews of him. I really like that guy. Just like his whole shtick is just great. He's like funny and spunky and quirky, and you can tell just very intelligent. Fun to listen to on an interview. And it's funny that this guy who just seems pretty jovial created this very dark series. But I appreciate that.
Yeah, I think as well, Black Mirror always seems to me to have a strong Ballardian influence. Sort of aesthetically as well. In particular, maybe that you have this kind of chilly world, I guess, in which Ballard really describes before it arrived. I think this kind of neoliberal chill or sort of world of atomized individuals, where we are all trying to pursue our obsessions, kind of in a sort of solitary mode. Just like Ballard himself, he was a kind of prophet for that lifestyle.
If nothing else, atomization is absolutely a theme that rides across nearly everything we're talking about. It's more or less urban. It's more or less being physically alone, but it all has an atomization in common.
Yeah, but in Ballard's case, this isn't. I don't think this should be viewed as purely bad or purely negative. Ballard rather saw such developments as things to be adapted to, because he didn't think, we could really change much about the way the world is going, because it just kind of follows its own logic, right? So we need to adapt somehow to what's happening around us. And this kind of atomization is this, sort of being turned on your own, put back on your own resources. He would view as in some ways bad, sort of a bit of a sort of a like Robinson Crusoe situation for many of us, but at the same time it allows us to kind of delve into maybe the sort of untouched or unexplored aspects of our personalities. So that's what Ballard's characters tend to do, these very solitary protagonists of his.
I do really wonder if his wife had never died. I believe she died and left him with like 3 kids. And I think that really colored his view of the world. And I think that was like the premise for a lot of his stories in the Atrocity exhibition, and just trying to deal and make sense of the world after that, incredibly, horrible and cruel thing happened to him. And, his wife, obviously, and his kids. It's interesting how that could have, if that had never happened, how different his whole view of the world would have been, and how different his stories would have been as a result. Because there is that darkness that kind of like underlies it a lot.
Yeah, it's a good question. Does he have much writing before the death of his wife, and what kind of sentiment?
Quite a bit.
Good question. Yeah. She died in 1964. So when did he? Yeah. I just looked this up. So his early novels were before she died. He had 3 novels before she died, it looks like, and some short story collections. Interesting.
Even the early novels are quite dark, I would say. You have Drowned World, and you have basically civilization has collapsed because of flooding. The polarized caps have melted due to a sort of sun activity, extraordinary sun activity, and you have this character who doesn't do what you might expect. He rather embraces the logic of the landscape. He goes further south into the hotter latitudes, in sort of pursuing his maybe his primitive self, in a sense. So they're quite dark and kind of strange from the beginning, I would say, Ballard's fiction. But certainly, the death of his wife just sent him further in that direction, for sure. And he said, that he felt like nature had committed a crime, a terrible crime, by taking this woman's life and robbing her children of their mother. So I think there was a kind of there's a feeling of things like in Atrocity Exhibition or Crash of great anger and a kind of desire to sort of wreak some kind of revenge on the world. But it's also balanced, I think, by a very strong moral sensibility, where he wants to try and portray the world as truthfully as he can and draw some moral lessons from that.
Do you see any kind of like a theme of anger at God in any of his work? Because it doesn't seem like it, and yet you mentioned the anger at. Did you say anger at? He felt anger at God for taking his wife.
No. He said nature. He put it as nature.
Okay, nature.
Yeah. But Ballard is, he doesn't remain consistent on this point, on what he believes in a sort of religious sense. But he did say that he didn't have conventional religious views, but sometimes he talked about nature as a kind of higher power. Sometimes he talks about the unseen powers of the cosmos. And then even occasionally he does talk about God, but very, very rarely, but sometimes. So
yeah, that's quite British. It's funny on this theme of the presence of God and religiosity. I was it's somewhat aside, but I was watching a Top of the Pops Christmas special from Britain in 1984, and they had Frankie Goes to Hollywood and various other acts with very little sort of Christmas theme. And that same year, the U.S. had a Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton Christmas special where God came up a million times. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
Wow.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised that God just doesn't figure much into Ballard.
That's a good comparison. Also, it's interesting that kind of in the same way, for comparing like Ballard to like Philip K. Dick, Dick has way more of a Christian ethos that's kind of like underpinning a lot of his vision of the world in the future that is definitely absent from Ballard.
That's part of the explanation why he gets adapted so much more. That's not to say that Hollywood is particularly Christian. They're not, but they. When making
the Christ figure obsession, yeah,
there's a kind of latent quasi Christianity still running throughout even mainstream Hollywood that comes through. Thinking about what past works they can expect to make a lot of money, and so they're still kind of coasting off of Christian inspired, Christian informed 20th century works, 19th century works even.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ballard mentions much more often than any kind of Christian references. He mentions classical Greek references. Like he said, for example, the death of Princess Diana was a classical death because it was like she was pursued by the Furies. These
in a car crash as well. That's
yeah. So it seems to me like Ballard he went to a public school. Quite a posh school, and I mean, I'm sure he learned, he studied the classics there, and they seem to have, like many writers, really, they left some mark on him, and also there was, in Britain, I think other European countries, there was a kind of a status aspect here, if you could speak about the classics, if you had that kind of view of Greek tragedy and so on, it was a bit of a marker of sophistication and being part of the elite. So he did mention those things sometimes, and I think he saw a lot of truth in those, in the classics, and that would maybe align more with his beliefs, I think, because he's also said, he didn't believe in the afterlife. That when he was looking forward to his death, I mean, he just thinks he's going to disappear into oblivion, right? So, again, he's not completely consistent on this point, right? So, but that tends to be the view that he presents. So it seems to me that there's a kind of like a pagan side to Ballard, really, in my view. Whereas, as you say, Philip K. Dick, much more of a Christian, and this is quite a unmarked difference between the two.
Yeah. In the U.S., we've seen The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe become rebooted. Christian author, of course, J.A.R. Tolkien. Christian.
Mhm.
C.S. Lewis.
C.S. Lewis. Oh well, C.S. Lewis was Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, right? And then Lord of the Rings is Tolkien.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Tolkien's
Tolkien.
Lord. Yeah.
Hmm.
Those are obviously huge franchises now.
But
Ultimately, Chris.
I don't think they've been very faithful to Tolkien, have they? Because they got sex scenes in there, which I'm sure Tolkien would not approve of.
Oh really? I don't
True.
remember any. Which one?
In the new series, yeah, the TV series which is appearing.
Oh,
Oh, I didn't even
Um,
know there was a TV series. When is
I
that coming
know.
out?
Pretty soon, I think. I think early next year, as I remember. But yeah, they're gonna do basically Game of Thrones in Middle Earth. Yeah. So
Okay, that makes
yeah.
sense that they would do that. Yeah.
yeah.
It's interesting. So is it J.R.R. Tolkien or just J.R.?
JRR, yeah, two
Okay,
R's there.
okay. I was
Yeah.
about to say, what's with all the R's? George R.R. J.R.R. Okay, never mind.
Yeah, I mean Tolkien was, yeah, he was a very devout Christian, and there's really no sex in Lord of the Rings, as far as I remember, and I think they're going to really do an injustice to poor old Tolkien here, and many of the fans, are probably going to turn away in disgust, but I think they're banking on getting a whole new raft of fans, really.
Yeah,
Uh,
they might be going after the same people who are excited about the Wheel of Time on Amazon Prime.
right.
Wheel of Time, Amazon Prime. Um, yeah, I don't know. That is based on a series of books. I'm almost positive, but I don't know who the author is, but I know it's considered fairly progressive. It's something
Hmm.
about a mostly female, multiracial cabal of people trying to do right by something against ossified old white men. I think, but
Okay.
I'm hearing that from cranky right wing Twitter, who might just be seeing what they want to see.
Right. But I mean, I think, it's a pretty good chance that it's going to be that, I think, when you consider what's being made now. Um, yeah, I mean, it does seem to be more and more just propaganda, really, the what is produced by these companies. Um, it's obviously it's just blatant propaganda. Yeah. And there's not really much of an artistic merit at all in these series. Um, actually, the only series I watch really are the documentaries nowadays. Sometimes those are really good. I think there are talented people working in the documentary field.
Yeah, well,
Yeah, I agree. Although I've just kind of, I just can't do series anymore. I almost just kind of like just see one and just immediately look away because so many of them they just could be hour-long movies and they just become bloated and they just like make it a series because they just want to keep people's eyeballs on the screen. Um, I know that Netflix has said that their biggest competitor isn't like Amazon Prime or Hulu or anything. It's sleep. People sleeping is their biggest competitor, so they just want to keep people
wow.
glued to their device watching the show. And I think it shows. And I mean, there are some obviously good series, but in general, I think that they just like, oh man, we have like this is a 10-minute episode, but we gotta make it 45 minutes. I feel so much of that. Like every time I try to watch one of these things. So nowadays I just kind of avoid them. I don't know what
It's
I'm
odd
missing,
that
but
attention spans are getting shorter at the same time this stuff is getting longer. You know,
that is fascinating. Yeah.
but yeah, it seems like every movie now is 3 hours, at least if it goes to theater. Uh, I mean, I can anticipate like comedies in general just no longer being made for theaters. You know, it's just going
Right.
to be something. It's going to be dramatic. It may be lighthearted.
Yeah.
It'll be still be
There
something.
still is a whole world of movies being made by first-time writer-directors, and they're an hour and a half, and they're really great. Like I just watched the new Nicolas Cage movie called Pig, just called Pig, and it came out I think this year. It was great. It was like a great movie, and I looked up the
Oh
guy
yeah,
who wrote it and directed it. It's like a first-time writer-director, and it wasn't bloated. It wasn't like I mean, it was just like a beautiful film that you
it
would just
wasn't
never
Coach Pig.
imagine. It's about this guy, Nicolas Cage, who lives outside of Portland, and he has a pig, like a truffle pig, and the truffle pig gets stolen, and the whole movie is him tracking the truffle pig down. But it's not. You think that, oh, this might be like a comedy or something. It was like a dramatic thriller, like slow pacing, but in a good way. And it was just like a shockingly beautiful film. I think it also bizarrely has like 90% of Rotten Tomatoes. Like people loved it. It's like a great film.
Yeah,
And also another one comes to mind is like The Vast of Night on Amazon. First time writer director, like a sci-fi film, but like just beautifully done
I
and
saw that one.
low
It's
budget.
about,
I mean, everything about it. Like, so I mean, I have hope for cinema because of like films like that.
okay, yeah, Vast of Night. I think I might have watched that one. Is that about like getting some kind of a receiving some kind of alien signal from?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and I think it takes place like in the 70s. It was a while ago that I watched it. Yeah, about like low budget, but you wouldn't even know it's low budget by the way they can make movies these days.
Yeah,
Okay, I'm gonna make a note of this one. This sounds good.
well, yeah. There are a lot of yeah. As long as you have no hope that what you want to see by way of cinema has to be seen in a theater. Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff, and yeah, there's a new who was it? Paul Verhoeven film called Benedetta, I think. I forgot the name of it, but that was
Right.
recommended to me yesterday in a podcast I was on.
Okay.
It's
Okay.
called Benedetta.
Benedetta. Okay.
It's a bit odd for Verhoeven too, who does kind of sci-fi stuff, because this takes place in the 17th century and it's about a lesbian nun.
Okay. Right. I do have a bit of a theory about what's driving this kind of production of these things like Lord of the Rings TV series, and it seems to me, as you mentioned about the attention spans getting shorter, and things like TikTok, the Zoomers are into things like TikTok, which is just instant gratification, just kind of watching for 10 or 15 seconds and that's it, right? And then watch the next one. So it seems to me that the sort of strategy that Hollywood and other, sort of outlets like Netflix and Amazon Prime are going for is to try to cultivate fandoms, to sort of create a fandom around your IP, your intellectual property, which will then be loyal. Yeah. So series are obviously ideal for this kind of thing because you can just spin it out as long as you want, right? As many seasons as it can carry on, and of course you can produce merchandise, and you can get your fans really on social media promoting your property, your intellectual property, and I think this is one very important reason why they're putting politics into these franchises,
Yeah.
Because they can kind of jump on the back of social justice movements and so on. So that you can use that then to promote your property, right? But it all depends on creating these fandoms who are often fanatical groups, right? who just it's a rather sad extent, really. They get involved in Marvel, cinematic universe. And it takes over their lives, and we all know people. We've all seen people like this on the internet, right?
It's funny. I watched. Well, I watched that recently, but a little while ago, I watched the movie Mallrats from 1995. It's a Kevin Smith movie. He did Clerks, that guy, and he's kind of coasting on the tales of his hotness way back then. He's involved in stuff, but he's not like the celebrated filmmaker he once was. But Mallrats, it's about people who just kind of hang out at malls, don't have much of a life, and that the protagonists are really into Marvel comics. They love Marvel comics, but they're supposed to be sort of like the slacker in society who's just sort of hanging out at the mall with nothing to do, making fun of all the normies who are busy coming and going or working at the mall. They're just hanging out and doing shit all. Interesting how much that slacker perspective that it's so much into comic books is now the mainstream. It's now the normie thing. And I saw the lineup of the 2022's biggest films, and it looks like Stan Lee and Marvel are just all over it. So that is the normative cinematic experience now. They're no longer complaining about the mainstream from the periphery. They are in the center. These comic books.
Yes. I think we talked a bit about this, with Mark Fisher, right, in the first interview. And the idea, I think you talked about the recombining elements of the 20th century kind of over and over, right? Because you've kind of run out of ideas. So you're just drawing upon these 20th century sources. And it's obviously an element of that, isn't there? A very, very big part of the reason why they're doing that is that it's just a property which they've got, and they're not really willing or able to develop anything new.
Yeah, the Atlantic had an interesting article, I think it was last week, and it was about how Hollywood is running out of ideas, and so they just keep doing the same stories again and again and again just to make money. But then the article emphasized that it's not just Hollywood and these same stories. This is also in academia, in scientific papers, and in technology, and it went through all these different fields. And for example, in scientific publishing, rather than like back in the day, like 20 years ago or whenever, academics, researchers would cover the gamut with their research topics. And nowadays, they all congregate around a few very specific, very safe topics. And so because that's what they get funding for, that's what's easy to get research on. And it's just like the safe topics, right? And the examples of this, how they're very it's just like clear cut that this exists as a problem, is kind of depressing, because we are just like limiting our imagination, like full stop, across like many different fields. And it's a little bit disheartening, but it also does kind of show that, there's a problem, and identifying that as a specific problem is hopefully, I mean, I'm optimistic, something that future generations will really like pinpoint that as something to get past.
Yeah, so we see a kind of slow cancellation in the future in things beyond strongly cultural output. You're saying it's even showing up in academic research, huh?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure if I can pull up the article on the fly, but it gave like really specific examples of like charts about like this is where people are all now focusing all their time and energy on very specific topics, and they're all the same things. And so we're just not discovering, what we could be if we were casting a wider net in academia. And it just feels true in the atmosphere. It really does. And even in politics, we just rehash the same ideas again and again and again and again. Almost no one has any original ideas. I mean, Andrew Yang championed UBI, but like even that's an idea that was like popular in the 70s. I mean, almost no one is really, really thinking outside the box.
Yeah, it's funny how robots will take our jobs is considered novel. That's a theme that has recurred a lot, but that was fairly new actually for a mainstream politician to be talking about. So we even included that as something refreshing, right?
Well, the Fisher's view, when you're talking about hauntology, of this kind of it's kind of being stuck, repeating the same old routines. Well, he thought that especially the left was haunted by the sense that the future that it had envisaged, hadn't really come to pass, had been sort of denied, and that there was a kind of compulsion to relive or to reenact those kind of forms of the past, as if that would kind of make that future come about against all the odds. And I think there is some sense of that, for example, there's a culture war, the left and right culture war, where both sides are kind of drawing upon, I think, models which are really kind of out of date, let's say Marxism, or on the right, kind of fascism, on the far right. Where these things really kind of in the 90s we thought communism was dead, right? And Marx was kind of proved wrong. But all these things are kind of being dug up again, sort of brought back into the light of day, but in a rather stale state. And it seems like, there's so many young people are fascinated again by Marx or by, I don't know, Julius Evola and, these kind of far left or far right figures, as if they want, to that kind of vision, that future, which didn't come about. They're trying to reanimate it,
Okay, that's interesting, because
yeah.
it did come about for a lot of people in the world. They just weren't here. So,
Right.
I mean, yeah. So behind the Iron Curtain and everything, it's just so it's nostalgic for something that is new to them.
Yeah.
And to get really banal, I'll harken back to an NBC phrase in the '90s: "New to you." That is like they're playing reruns and they wanted to put a good polish on it. If you haven't seen it, it's new to you. So in a way, communism is new to a lot of youthful Western people, as it's been, it seems, even when it was a live player.
Well, even in the Soviet Union, they didn't claim to have achieved communism. The communism was a kind of like a goal in the future, that they were on their way to communism. So
really, I didn't.
Yeah.
Even in, say, 1960, the Soviet Union said they hadn't achieved it.
That's right. Yeah. There was the famous expression, the real existing socialism, right? So this was what was how the Eastern Bloc was described, and then there was this kind of promise,
even from within the Eastern Bloc. Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah. I mean, there was a kind of a promise that communism would be achieved, and they were tapping into a kind of vision, a utopian vision, which had kind of been around really for a long time, probably going back to the 19th century and time of Marx himself, where there was this kind of idea that this is where the world was heading, and there's a kind of promise, a kind of latent promise in the world, in the sense that the Soviet Union was going to deliver upon. But of course, by the 80s, it was becoming blatantly obvious that they were never going to deliver upon that, right? So, it was always seen as something not quite achieved yet.
Okay, so in contrast, politicians and VIPs in North America and in the West, they did say that we were experiencing capitalism. That capitalism isn't some far-off dream; we are in it. But they did not in communism.
Right.
Nominally.
That's true, but I think even in the capitalist countries, modernity generally, right, is kind of orientated towards this future, this future of promise, and we're always kind of looking to some future which is supposedly better, and not only better, I would say, but kind of transformed in a kind of profound way. There is that kind of millenarian sort of undercurrents now, I think.
Okay, but this idea of the future as like a talking point and thing they go back to, that is what Mark Fisher is saying is dead now, right? You don't really see much of that. You don't see politicians making such grandiose promises about a great future. They've sort of stopped.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Fisher was saying that not only is there not much talk about the future being kind of an improvement. You do see that, I suppose, from the Democrat Party in America, but it's not really. I don't think it's much great conviction behind it.
Yeah.
But also in the culture generally, sort of generally the future is more and more kind of ignored, really, and just kind of not envisaged, right? I think in the 90s.
Oh, well, I was just going to jump in, but I'm kind of curious. I'm not familiar with Fisher, but I'm curious if there's, right now, everything moves so quickly and changes so quickly that maybe the idea of forming your politics around the future is either like frightening or naive, in a sense that we just don't know what's going to happen, because things are going to be different, between the moment you say it this afternoon and like tomorrow morning when you wake up.
Good point.
I
Yeah.
wonder if that could be the case, because you could in the 70s have a vision for the future and have 10 years to accomplish it. Nowadays, if you have a vision for the future, in 5 years from now, maybe there's no more malaria or AIDS because we fixed that. I mean, like, and in that sense, like we just are living in a different world, right? Um, I don't know, because I do see that there is no vision for the future out there, and I tend to think it's a bad thing, but that might be my semi-optimistic gloss on it.
Yeah, I feel like the avalanche of current events. I call it current eventsism. There's just so much of it. It gives the impression of a constantly changing world where I don't know if it is all that much. I don't think it's changing that quickly, and yet it feels like it is. There's kind of a running in place aspect to modernity.
Mm-hmm. There's a
Yeah,
kind of spectacle of change.
Right.
I think it depends on the domain. Again, in most culture, we are just rehashing old ideas. But I mean, just a couple of just quick examples, like the mRNA vaccine is a complete game changer, and CRISPR, complete game changer. These things shouldn't have existed in a sense, and now they're such powerful tools and such cheap tools that we're really talking about, like, modern medicine being transformed very, almost overnight. And I think that, I mean, this is something that like Ray Kurzweil always talks about, that progress and innovation doesn't happen steadily. It doesn't go up, 1 year after the next. It goes up on an S-shaped curve, so that there's stagnation, 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 and then it jumps up, and then stagnation, stagnation, then it jumps again. And we're right now in biotech, we're in one of those jump phases where overnight we're going to wake up tomorrow with like new technologies to cure diseases. And, also we're same thing with, considering aging as a disease, where pretty soon we're going to have a real arsenal against, apparently, against the aging process. And we can already like turn back the age of mice, this sort of a thing. And I think it's going to be the same thing with maybe another just quick example is the idea of like the metaverse, right? We're supposedly kind of, Mark Zuckerberg's going to try to push us into this. I like the idea that Scott Galloway has talked about, that we're going to seamlessly wake up in the metaverse and not even know it. And it's not because of Facebook, it's going to be because of Apple, that, for example, we already right now walk around, most of us, with the Apple earbuds, AirPods in our ears, and they have a patent to make it so that the next version of them are going to have sensors, so that it senses the space around you and can take pictures. All of a sudden, like, that's the device that puts you in an AR, VR world, and it's going to be completely seamless. We're not even going to know about it. It's not like, oh, you're now on Facebook with the headset. It's, oh, you have your earbuds in, and now they have this new capability. Oh, and now, by the way, you live in an AR, VR world, and you didn't even know it. And it's going to be a jump where it's like overnight it's going to be there, just like overnight we all had like iPhones. That to me is really interesting, and I think that is in the sense that the future is really like gonna just like cascade around us in the sense that we didn't even expect it.
Wow, cool. Okay, you want to say anything else, Segulian?
I just want to say maybe I can see what Peter was talking about actually coming true, but of course I have a much more pessimistic view of it. Kind of Baudrillardian view of it. Well, I think what Peter was describing is really a kind of deepening of this virtual world, which I talked about in the first discussion, and a kind of further separating, of the human race from any kind of truth or reality. So it is quite a disturbing prospect, I would say. But anyway, that's maybe I can return to that in a future talk.
Okay. Well, yeah, I have to admit, so there's a couple different, well, maybe more than just two. I'm thinking now, though, I'm modeling two reference points by which you can determine if the future is not arriving or it's arriving fairly on time. You can look at actual industry trends, which it sounds like maybe Peter did, or you can just think back on what movies have depicted as what will arrive by what time. And the the latter is not the best way to do it. Yet I admit that I'm probably much more informed by that. I know I am much more informed by that, by what fiction has told me should be occurring by 2021, and not necessarily what industry and governments have actually provided thus far.
Right.
On what kind of schedule, right? So, all right. Well, I think I'm going to wrap it up. It's fairly late where you are, Julian. So, yeah. Thanks.
It's 11.
And Harry,
thanks. Yeah. Thanks a lot for having me.
Great to meet you, and thanks so much, Dan, and great to talk to you guys.